Hi, Mihir. Welcome to the Moto Asha podcast. Uh, I'm at a garage today called Hyperion, well known in Pune. The guy, a young dynamic guy who's come from Ford, MG, and started his own business. So we thought we'd just drop by, have a chat with him about service, maintenance, and I mean he's hands on. So what better? So go ahead, Mihir. Tell us about yourself and yeah.
Hey, Sohaib, it's a pleasure being on the Moto Asha podcast today. So I hope it's going to be informative for a lot of people. I thought we'd just go over some of the basics today, get into a bit of what it takes to maintaining your motorcycle to keep it running well. So the usual minor service and major service that you need to do on time to make sure you don't end up with expensive repairs or worse, an accident.
Yeah. So let's get straight into it. So a 10,000 kilometer service, someone comes in. What do you tell them, and what has to go? What do you think has to be the place? What has to be serviced? Yeah.
So 10,000 is a number that's usually given for the minor service. So it would really depend on what sort of motorcycle you're riding. If you have something that uses mineral oil like Royal Enfield, you're going to want to service every 3,000 kilometers. But if you are using full synthetic oil, which can run longer, and you run that engine oil very often, so let's say you're doing a lot of kilometers, and then you can go in for that change at 10,000 kilometers. So usually at a 10,000 kilometer service, what we do in our shop is we start off with changing the oil. The oil filter has to be changed with every time you change the oil. There's no shortcuts to that. We check everything, so all the electricals are checked. We clean out the air filter. If it needs to be replaced with a factory OEM replacement, then that's what we do. If it's a aftermarket air filter, then it needs to be cleaned and recharged. Then another important part is cleaning and lubing the chain. So first thing would be to wash down the whole bike. Make sure every single nook and cranny is clean, because that will let you know if there's some bigger problem, especially with oil leaks and certain cracks and things like that, which are not noticeable if it's got mud caked on. And then check the tires. Tires are very important. Get the brake pads out, clean the caliper, clean the brake pads, get rid of any high spots with some emery paper if required. There's two different schools of thoughts on sanding down your brake pads. Some people swear by it and they say it helps to improve the brake feel. A lot of other people say you shouldn't do that. It's really preference. You can do what makes you feel comfortable and gives you confidence. Usually in a minor service, that's not a time where we would change the brake fluid, but definitely you want to check for it. And if you've done 2 years with your brake fluid, just replace it. It's not expensive, and it's something that goes a long way, because if your brake pads wear down,
Yeah.
there is a rubber diaphragm in the brake master reservoir, and it will compensate for the lack of distance when the brake pads are worn out. But you also want to make sure that there's no water, there's no brake dust,
Yeah.
you don't have air in the system. And the easiest way to do this is remove the old brake fluid, put in new brake fluid, and flush the whole system.
Yeah.
So bleed it out. Well, with the minor service, you also want to be cleaning things like your injectors and the throttle body at about 10,000 kilometers. Again, there are some customers who just go in for the major service when they want to do this, but it is recommended doing it in the minor service as well, because those are expensive parts, especially things like injectors and throttle bodies. And keeping them clean makes sure your bike runs well, it runs smooth and runs well for long.
So if you have to start off, you start off from the back and say, let's go chain, brake pads, the whole sprocket, the front sprocket, get that cleaned up, oil filter, air filter. Is there anything more on the front that you have to check on apart from the
Yeah,
brake
so what you do need to check on, because to make sure you have good handling and good brakes, you also want your forks and suspension to be working well.
Yeah.
So typically we ensure that people change their the fork oil every year.
Okay.
But you also want to check for any leaks. So if you have fork seals that are leaking, that's something that's a good time to take care of it. if your motorcycle comes with adjustable suspension, that's a good time to readjust and make sure that it's what's right for you. And there's a lot of aspects, like you want to check your cone set bearings, because at the end of the day, when you're going fast and you're braking hard, every small thing makes up that experience. So if your cone set is slightly worn out, you're going to feel the bike pulling to one side, and that's not safe, and it's also not pleasurable to ride a bike like that. If your fork oil is worn out and you need to replace it, then you're going to start feeling the front forks bottoming out. That's also not a good feeling. So it's all a combination of what you want to do to make sure your bike runs well, and making sure if there are any future things that come up, the minor services where you take a look at it and prepare for that when you do your major service.
Yeah. So if I have to get it right, your 10K or the year service is basically checks and things that just get serviced, fluids get serviced. You've mentioned something about fork oil, which I was going through my checklist on my bike, and it said to do it at 40,000 kilometers. But I'm guessing for our conditions, things have to be very different. So what are those things that you think have to be? So like oil, there's a lot of people who think even a fully synthetic oil should be changed at 6 to 8,000 kilometers instead of 10. So what are the things that you would suggest that, in our conditions, get it done faster?
Right. So for sure, going by the motorcycle manuals, these are usually imported bikes that come from Triumph, Kawasaki, different countries where they've been designed and developed. So you have to take that with a pinch of salt.
Yeah.
It's what allows them to safely say that your bike is going to be within their warranty period. That means it's designed for that, and you're going to want to replace it at, say, 40,000 kilometers for fork oil. But it's really your bike, and you have to use a little bit of common sense. If the fork oil looks bad, you have to replace it. And with our Indian conditions, where every time you take the bike out, it gets filthy.
Yeah.
You have a lot of dust going in through the dust caps, through the fork seals, and into the fork oil. So you really want to replace it every year if you do live in India. More so if you're riding in the dirt and going off road. So it's best to inspect things. Also, when you clean your chain, ideally you have to do it every 500 kilometers. But if it's dirty, it's time to do it.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, so I think you've covered a lot of the 10,000. What happens at a major service? I know a lot of my friends who get a heart attack when they, get a estimate on a major service bill. So why does that get so expensive? And what are the things that go into it that makes it so expensive? Right. Or what goes into it first?
Right. So one of the key characteristics of a major service is getting into the engine. So now this is the time you would do valve clearances, which is at around 24,000 kilometers. And once you're opening the valve covers, you need to make sure you're replacing the gaskets. It's quite a time-consuming process, and if not done correctly, it can be catastrophic. So when you look at the things that go into the major service, you're really rebuilding the bike. You're not just doing certain checks and replacing fluids and things like that. You're actually rechecking and making sure everything is the way the bike was meant to be from the factory. And many times a major service would also involve changing your tires, going with new brake pads, replacing your chain and sprocket, replacing your clutch at times. It depends on how hard you ride it. So all these are expensive components, and rightly so, because they have a very important job, and you should always use quality parts for such things. And all that adds up. And when you're doing a major service, the goal of doing that is that you end up with a brand new bike at the end of it. And you reset the clock and you're starting from 0 kilometers again.
Yeah. So I had a question when I was changing my spark plugs at 20,000, and NGK says you can continue those for 40,000 or 35,000 kilometers. But again, why does an OEM tell you to do it at 20 or at 10 on a major service, and why do they replace it even if it's not worn?
Right. So, having spent a lot of time designing and engineering vehicles myself, The one key aspect in service maintenance schedule is cost. So cost of ownership is a very important part when you design a particular part and put it into the vehicle. So if, for example, the cost for changing spark plugs was about say 8,000 rupees for changing 4 spark plugs, then you cannot expect a customer to do it every 2,000 kilometers because that cost is going to add up and he's not going to want to buy that motorcycle.
Yeah.
And word is going to spread out soon and you're going to have no sales.
Yeah.
So they do a lot of testing and they find out what is the point at which the spark plug can perform well, not perfectly, but perform well enough where you don't need to replace it.
Okay.
And especially when you're using iridium spark plugs, which they do work a lot longer, you can go up to 40,000 kilometers, even a lakh at times, without changing the spark plugs. But is it recommended? Probably not. But in order to make sure that your cost of ownership of the motorcycle is low, the manufacturers specify that you should go at a much later period than when we would typically change them.
Yeah, got it. So major services basically the whole engine is, it's not a rebuild but it's a recheck and it's almost a new experience that you have with your engine. Is there anything else that goes in a major service that makes it saying, or is it just you've checked it at 10 and then at 20 you have to replace it, something like that?
Right. So as I said, at the minor service you would make notes of things that do need maintenance later on, especially at the 20,000, 24,000 kilometer point. And you're really checking everything. So, at this point, you may even need to change the springs in your forks. So any wear out components, whether it's, brake pads, brake lines, you have chains and sprockets, you need to make sure it's within spec. And if the adjustability or the performance is degraded, it's best to change it at that time.
Yeah.
So what I would say is a minor service is the typical service you do once every year, and the major service is the service you do when certain parts of your motorcycle are no longer working the way they're supposed to. And it also depends on how much the person rides their motorcycle. If you're not going to ride 24,000 kilometers, which is actually quite a lot for some of the bigger bikes, then you may have to do this at a lower number of kilometers just because you've crossed maybe 4 or 5 years.
Yeah. So I had before there was a question that came to me, which was, if someone's kept their bike standing for say 6 years, just standing, and if it comes to a garage, would you do a major service or would you do just a normal 10,000 kilometer service and let it go?
Right. So it really depends on what type of motorcycle that is. Is it carbureted? Is it fuel injected? How big is the engine? So if it's been sitting for a period of 6 years, it's typically going to be an older bike, which the owner has just kept for sentimental values and isn't using on a regular basis. So yes, you do need to do the minor service for sure, but you don't necessarily need to replace everything because chances are the person is going to have that motorcycle sitting again for a long period of time. So you don't want to increase the cost of ownership by changing out parts that are working well and can work with just a little bit of TLC, cleaning it up, lubing it up, especially things like cables. You have the clutch cable, throttle cable. So you could replace them, but it really depends on how much the person is going to use the motorcycle again after that. So a major service is not really required, but it would be a good thing to do.
Yeah. Cool. So I think the 20K, the major also you've covered. If I was to tell you, hey, I wanna do my own service at home, a DIY service, is it doable? Is there an easy way out to do it? And are those parts that are doable by somebody and something that has to be handed over to a mechanic? What are those parts?
Right.
So is there a way out?
So definitely everything on a motorcycle can be done at home. There's nothing that's too difficult. The question is, make sure you have all the knowledge you have before you start doing anything. And if, for example, you're taking on a project that's a little more involved, make sure you have the right tools. Because having the right tools will ensure that you don't make any mistakes. Now, let's say, for example, you want to do the minor service at home, which I highly recommend people do on their own. It just makes the riding experience better. You can always come by to our shop and we're happy to help you and assist you work on your motorcycle yourself. So usually the minor service involves draining out the oil, changing the oil filter, removing the fuel tank to get access to the air filter and cleaning that out, which is fairly easy. Everyone should know how to clean and lube their chain. That is something that you need to do even on longer trips. You need to be doing it yourself at the hotel or wherever you're staying. I mean, long story short, if you want to do some DIY by yourself, go ahead. Just make sure you know what you're doing before you do it, and you have all the things you need to do it before you start working on it.
Yeah, very interesting because on one of the forums that I was on, the guys, I mean, in India still it's not as expensive as the West servicing major services. There was a guy who wrote to me and said, what you should do is if you want to cut your costs on maintenance, the things that you can do by yourself, the simple things, do it yourself. Like, the oil filters, air filters, do it yourself, get the panels out, because that's where the labor charges and the time goes into. And take that, once you've done most parts of it, take that bike then to the service and then get them to do all the complicated parts and get that paid. So you probably subsidize your cost on what you can do. And so have you seen people come in like that, or do you think it's a very Western concept still?
I haven't really seen it much.
Yeah.
It is a very Western concept because the average person in India does not like getting their nails dirty. But yes, there are a few people who have mentioned it to me that they would like to try things on their own.
Yeah.
And I think a safe environment to try that out is in my workshop, where they can bring their motorcycle in. They have access to all the tools. We'll take care of getting rid of the old oil, and if anything does go wrong, we're always there to help them out.
Yeah.
So I don't see DIY becoming more popular right away, but definitely if you want to become a good rider and you do long distances, it's something that you should have under your belt.
Have you seen anything get really, like, there's somebody has really messed up and come with something? Do you have a story for that?
Yeah, so some things that I don't recommend doing as your first DIY is changing the fork seals on your bike.
Okay.
You should probably do at least 10 oil changes before you try and get into that. But I did have a customer who came to me with his fork in his hand, and he said that I think I've messed up. The bolt stripped and it's just rotating.
Yeah.
So we had to then get the fork caps removed and helical coil and retap the screws, and it wasn't easy. And definitely something that could have been avoided with the right information. So yeah, for sure, take things step by step. Start with the minor service and oil change. I mean, I would say obviously cleaning your chain is the first thing you should know how to do, cleaning it and adjusting it. And then you can probably go into the air filter. That's probably the next easy thing. And then oil change, oil filter, and go on from there.
Great, Mihir. I think that was brilliant. There's a lot to learn than just riding your own motorcycle, and I think you're right though. People should know what they're getting into. Even the fact that, I mean, there's a lot of garages. I find them so much. There's so much information at garages where you can go there and sit and not bother the guy working on your bike, but still, you get information as to why he's doing that and all that, and that's important. So thank you so much. I think I'm sure there's a lot of people who learn from this episode. So yeah, thanks so much for being on this podcast today.
Thanks, Udai. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this podcast. I want to hear your stories, your motorcycle experiences, what you've been doing, and how motorcycles have made your life better. So if you have something to say, DM us on Instagram, and I'll be more than happy to get you on this podcast.